Welcome back to another episode of Games Denominations Play. This one was found on the gottesdienst.org website, and I wanted to cover it today. Despite it not being shared on any of the social media platforms that I normally cover when I look for transcription pieces, I felt that this was important to cover for today's Games Denominations Play. Like I said, this topic came directly from the Gottesdienst website, which is known as the Journal of Lutheran Liturgy. This article is titled On the Children's Sermon. This was posted by Larry Bean on May 4th, 2023. He writes as follows: I'm amazed that there are still people out there who think that by adding some fad element to the liturgy, we can, quote, grow the church, end quote, by, quote, attracting the youth, end quote. One of the worst of such techniques is the, quote, children's sermon, end quote, sometimes euphemistically called the, quote, children's message, end quote. First of all, it doesn't work. Children hate them, especially boys, especially introverts of both sexes, especially as the children get older. They come to dread being the center of attention, as well they should, and then they come to dread the divine service altogether. I remember one time going to an LCMS church with my wife and son, who was about 10 at the time, parentheses, and who routinely served with me at the holy altar as an acolyte, end parentheses. All he ever knew was our congregation. The pastor of this congregation called for all the children to come forward. My son was sitting on the other side of my wife. He discreetly leaned forward and side-glanced at me with an alarmed look in his eyes. I looked at him, gave him a reassuring nod, and motioned for him to stay put. We talked about it afterward, and he was pretty disgusted by the whole thing. The pastor awkwardly squatting in his alb in the holy chancel, the children being turned into a mini-show, the interruption of the liturgy. Why do you do this? It's gross. Church is about Jesus, not about putting your children, or more likely grandchildren, on yet another stage so that you can fawn over them and video them. And children, being raised in the digital age, know very well how to act when the camera is on. They know when something is real and something is a show. By teaching them that church is a show, you are teaching them that this stuff isn't real. Because if it were, if you really believed that the divine service is a miraculous, supernatural appearance of our Lord Jesus Christ in word and sacrament, you would react with reverence and awe, not flippance. You would focus on Jesus and not on turning the whole thing into a badly done school pageant. I think that any church that has the usual, quote, children's sermon, end quote, should insert another age-based liturgicus interruptus right afterward called the, quote, boomer sermon, end quote, in which the pastor invites all boomers to come down front to where they can become a spectacle for everyone's entertainment. Boomers say the cutest things, and the pastor could even quiz them on their catechism, and we can all get a chuckle at their responses and put it all over social media. That might even attract more boomers and, quote, grow the church, end quote. Seems legit? Some people seem to think that children are easily cowed and used as props because we can fool them some of the time. We can make them believe that stories and myths are true. We can perform magic tricks, and they don't realize that they are tricks. But children also have a good nose for hypocrisy. In that sense, they have fully developed bubulum circus detectors. They see right through your acting one way in church and another at home. They see you not praying before meals, except at church events. They see you worshiping at the altar of the TV. And when you make the service about them, they know that it isn't about Jesus. Here is the straight talk. We started dabbling in the church growth Ouija board in the 1980s to cover up the real problems that started leading to the declines in numbers that we are seeing coming into fruition now: infertility and unfaithfulness. Christians followed the secular culture to the demographic slaughterhouse by drinking the small family Kool-Aid. Quote, "Get an education first," end quote, we said as our children were encouraged to delay marriage. Of course, this led to a culture of premarital and even recreational sex, as well as a selfish, materialistic worldview that taught them that having children is economically irresponsible and the cause of unhappiness. Feminism taught young girls that motherhood was for chumps. Birth control and the acceptance of homosexuality also taught us that sexual relations were not about procreation, parentheses, which means making families, exclamation mark, and parentheses, but about self-gratification. And right on cue, led around by the nose by our cultural lords and masters, the cumulative effect of all of this was a decline in family size. Also, the cultural Disney World worldview of chasing after one's dreams and to be, quote, happy, end quote, above all, led the Christian faith and life to be relegated way down the priority list, lower than, quote, education, end quote, sports, recreation, cultural events, parties, proms, vacations, etc. Marrying within the faith was no longer even on the radar screen. We didn't care whom our children married, so long as they were, quote, happy, end quote. A lot of our formerly faithful families presided over the repaganization of their own children and grandchildren. And it really didn't concern them a whole lot until they began to see entire pews empty as their own generation began dying off and not being replaced. Empty pews grew to empty sections. Offerings declined. Many formerly robust churches now teeter on closure as boomers realize that they may not have a pastor to minister to them in their old age or even to officiate at their funerals. And so they look with desperation to fads and failed church growth movement monkey shines from the 1980s, getting rid of hymns, quote, creative worship, end quote, quote, contemporary worship, end quote, casuality, changing up or abolishing the liturgy, skits, getting rid of vestments, and, of course, the children's sermon. To paraphrase Hank Hill, you're not making children's ministry better, you're only making Christianity worse. What lesson does it teach when 1 minute the pastor reverences the altar, but the next minute he squats in front of it, legs awkwardly splayed out under his alb and disheveled stole, with buttocks planted on the chancel steps? Oh, that imagery is interesting. Again, children pick up on incongruities. They pick up on the nonverbals. That's no different than telling your kids not to smoke in between puffs. The, quote, children's sermon, end quote, has also led to other liturgical monkey shines, like having a layman, often a female layman, to come forward and engage in preaching. And yes, that's what it is, even if you call it a, quote, message, end quote, and claim it is only for children. If you do a Google image search on, quote, children's sermon, end quote, you will see an overwhelming female presence among such preachers, both lay and, quote, ordained, end quote. Specifically teaching children can, parentheses, and should, end parentheses, be done at home and in Sunday school or confirmation, parentheses, or early First Communion, end parentheses, instruction. But when you do it as a part of the divine service, it is something entirely different. It is no longer private teaching, but public proclamation. And how often do you hear the boomer canard, quote, I get more out of the children's message than I do out of pastor's sermon. Ha ha, end quote. If that's the case, maybe the problem is that you have been infantilized and dumbed down by not reading the Bible and living the Christian life. Just saying. On a practical note, a pastor once told me that he killed the children's sermon when he first came to a new congregation that insisted he do them. He brought all the kids down and instructed them how to make the sign of the cross. Apparently, the parents and grandparents, who were not of the Gottesdienst crowd, were horrified. That was the end of it. I need to put together a, quote, Gottesdienst children's message, end quote, series as a strategy to pull them out of our, quote, Missouri, end quote. Maybe we should bring the kids down, show them how many times the word, quote, Catholic, end quote, appears in our hymnals, teach them what the word, quote, Catholic, end quote, means, and how we Lutherans are Catholic Christians. Or how about bringing in a thurible and teaching the kids about incense and how wonderful it is to make our sanctuary like heaven with the incense of our prayers and the smell of Jesus filling our sanctuary. Maybe we could teach the kids about the Book of Concord and how our confessions use the words, quote, Mass, end quote, and, quote, priest, end quote, and use the title, quote, Father, end quote, for our pastors. Or maybe read the words of institution with the children and have them explain whether these words of Jesus call for one cup or many for the Holy Supper. Either one of two things would happen. The, quote, children's sermon, end quote, would stop, or we would gas the fire of the current generational rebellion against gimmicks and inauthenticity in our Christian faith and life. Our Lutheran young adults are yearning for authenticity, for something more profound than the superficial American lifestyle in which our Christian life is compartmentalized, deprioritized, and marginalized. Young Lutherans want the real deal. Let's give it to them in spades. At any rate, what we really need to do is once more become countercultural. Encourage young people to marry young, have big families, quit the sports, turn off the TVs, pray before meals and during the day as families, and have Dad lead those prayers. Dad needs to lead the family to church and inculcate the beautiful reality that Sunday is when we, quote, get to go, end quote. We need to find ways for our Lutheran youth to grow up with piety, as Christians committed to the Bible, the confessions, and within our biblical and confessional tradition, and then to meet other pious young people who want to start families and raise them in the faith. No gimmick will fix this. And frankly, most gimmicks are actually counterproductive. The one sermon delivered by the pastor focused on Christ and the gospel, and a no-nonsense explication of the word is the children's sermon, the boomer sermon, and everyone in between's sermon. Preach for everyone. Preach Jesus. Abolish the spectacle and restore the mass. To be continued. ... First, before I get into my thoughts on this article, I want to talk about the photo that he posted at the top of the page before he began this article. The photo shows a young woman pastor. And I say pastor because she's wearing the white gown and the stole over her shoulders. And she's seated in front of the altar. And she's surrounded by kids of various ages around her, most of whom look like they're paying attention. There's going to be a couple in most children's sermons that don't pay attention, and obviously we do see at least 3 kids here who look like they're not paying attention. But for the most part, everybody else on the floor that is in front of her is listening, or appears to be listening to her. All right, that being said, let's dive into the numerous problems of this article. First, he thinks that the children's sermon is a fad element. That has been around as long as I have been around, and that is at least 30 years. Granted, depending on what church you're at, there might be more or less of use of the children's sermon, and I kind of think it depends on as much the membership as it does on the pastors' and congregations' views on the children's sermon. But I would say it is not something new, and it is not something that's completely unheard of. I do find it hilarious that he writes an entire article on how we shouldn't do the children's sermon, as if it's the children's sermon that is breaking one of the crucial foundations of the church today. Oh no, you have a children's sermon. You don't care about the actual sermon or the congregation you're preaching to. You are ruining Christianity for all of us. At least, that's how I imagine him when he goes to his monthly board meetings and he wants to let everyone know in the congregation just how much he hates the children's sermon. Now, I do find it crucial to point out here that he has a son, and that his son, as he mentions it, routinely serves with his father at the holy altar as an acolyte. He's not going to know anything about the children's sermon, and his shock, at least to me, is not uncommon considering he doesn't have it, or his current church doesn't have it. However, when you as the parent are using the terms awkward squatting, show, interruption of liturgy, all of which are weird, gross terms, and later on you continue to use even weirder imagery. But that begs the question, how much of it is the son's shock and disgust versus the parent's shock and disgust? I feel for the kid. He doesn't know how to relax, sit back, or even to not have an opinion on something. At least, not when it comes to something that you, as the parent, are disgusted by. Note that the author uses words like stage, and he talks about people fawning over the kids and videoing the kids, and church is just becoming a show. Well, I'm sure we can all remember when people like the author here were very disturbed at the idea of putting projectors in a church, or having live streaming equipment, or even having a screen up in front so that people could see and read the words of hymns or responses better. I'm fairly confident that this would have been the attitude of this author, in that he would just be reacting with shock and horror and disgust, and that it would all be considered a show. He does rightfully point out that there tends to be a hypocrisy between people's belief at home versus the church. But in this case, he tries to bring it home by saying that we are making the church service about the children when we have a children's sermon. Are we really making it about the children? Not only is a children's sermon used as an outreach technique, but many congregations that have families with younger children tend to be drawn more to that, because then their children are being addressed in a mini sermon that is meant to be just the condensed version of the sermon that is about to happen. And there are some people that find benefit in that. Also, the fact that the kids hurl themselves down the aisle towards the altar to sit down, listen to the pastor, and then again hurl themselves with the same amount of energy back towards their parents is at once amusing and, I'm sure, a godsend for the poor parents. Their kids are burning off energy. Let them burn off energy. After all, Jesus said, "Let the little children come to me." What are we doing if not reaching out directly to the children in a way that children can understand? What is wrong about that? But no, according to the author, there is only one good sermon. And that sermon does not need to be condensed down or told to children in a way that children can understand. No, that sermon was already perfect, and the children's sermon is just ruining it. I did get a huge laugh, if you didn't notice, over his description of the boomer sermon. Actually, I personally would love to see a bunch of boomers, my parents included, to go up for a boomer sermon and just have it be a quiz of their knowledge of the church and church traditions. Or, even possibly more funny, but also equally sobering, have them asked about key biblical principles, things that Jesus said and did. I would like to see that. Wouldn't you? If nothing else, it would serve to show us just how much or how little those people who claim to be Christians and sit in church really care about the Word of God and following what Jesus asked of us. The author then goes into a multiple paragraph rant over the church growth Ouija board, and he thinks that there are two real problems that led to church decline: infertility and unfaithfulness. Now, I don't know if he would include women who can't naturally conceive as infertile, but he definitely dislikes the small family Kool-Aid, as he likes to call it, which I will point out, it's Flavor-Aid, it's not Kool-Aid. Get your facts straight. He also doesn't like that we're encouraging our children to get an education first and then marriage. Birth control, feminism, happiness, those are all big, big evils. Apparently, so is using sex as self-gratification. Did you know that you could use sex to have a good time and not just have kids? Who would have thought that? Definitely not Adam and Eve. Don't ask how many kids they had. He seems to be very unhappy about the decline in family size, which would make sense considering the strict terms he puts on just being a good Lutheran in general. And that's not even addressing the good Christian part. This is just how to be a good Lutheran. And not the very last, but the second to last paragraph, he emphasizes that only good Lutherans will be married young, have big families, don't do sports, don't watch TV, pray before meals and during the day, and only Dad can lead those prayers. What happens when Dad works? Like, either 9 to 5, or say he's a police officer, or firefighter, and he can't be around to lead those prayers. Is the mom okay to lead those prayers? Or is her status as a female in the church just automatically relegate her to second-class citizen? Does she need to ask the pastor to lead those prayers? I genuinely need to know the answer to this question. I mean, he did emphasize it that Dad needs to lead the family, and he needs to lead those prayers. Moms, you can't lead the family to church. You can't lead your family in prayer. That's only Dad's job, according to this article writer. The fact that he is strict on the young people marrying young and having big families concerns me, though. How can you expect to have a decent offering size if you have two 18-year-olds who married and, they start having kids? Granted, you got at least 3 years where you could reasonably expect them to produce 3, but with today's inflation rates and today's economy, you just can't afford to have a family of a size greater than 3, and definitely not when you're 18. What kind of job prospects are you encouraging your young people to have? Because let's be real here, you need a job to survive in today's economy. It didn't matter back then as much if you had a degree to make a decent amount of money. But in today's world, you either need to be part of the trades or you need to have a degree to be considered for most, if not at least 90% of the job market out there. Keep in mind I'm throwing out that number, but anytime I've ever been interviewed, they always make a big deal about what college did I go to and did I graduate. That is the same for any young person out there. It doesn't matter now if you're male or female. You need to go out there and get an education. I know the author just spent the entire article telling us about how evil that is and how you just need to have a whole ton of kids, but in order to make it anywhere and to have a decent income, to even have kids you want, or maybe being forced to have, you need to have an education. Again, doesn't matter if it's the trades or if it's an associate's degree or bachelor's degree, but you need to go out there and get a job just so you can afford to survive. And that's before you bring kids into the picture. That's another thing that bothers me about people like the author here. They claim to care so much about children, but really they just want people with children to attend churches regularly so that their children will attend regularly and then get married young and then have more children to attend regularly. They don't really care about the children. They don't care about treating them as little mini humans who need to be trained in order to not ruin anybody else's lives, property, or, their goals. No, it's never about how to train up children or how can we encourage them to be the best that they can be. It's always mass-produce children, mass-produce children. Why should we mass-produce children? So that they will, in turn, mass-produce children in order to support the church. And then, doing one more once-over this entire article, you wonder, well, he says that what we really need to do is once more become countercultural. What he does not say is, we need to focus on authenticity, so therefore we need to go back to Jesus. Our focus needs to be on Jesus. Our focus needs to be on the Son of God who came down and was authentically concerned for everybody around him. His concern for everyone was so great that he would put himself at risk physically on behalf of others. Think of the woman who was to be stoned by the religious leaders of her day. Jesus stepped in. Jesus stepped in on behalf of multiple people. When religious leaders tried to start fights with him, Jesus kept shooting down their points. Not out of a sense of superiority, but because he was seeing just how damaging the religious leaders were being to the people of their time. That's what really convinces me to avoid recommending this article to anyone, even for the one or two reasonable points that the author makes here, because the author does not focus on bringing people's views back to Jesus. He does not focus on how the church can lead the way in becoming more Christ-like and in serving people around them. No, he focuses on how the church can be more stringently Lutheran, on how the church should enforce its members to be more stringently Lutheran, and how strict that adherence must be, and how he is the one authority to have the correct opinion on this, and anyone else is just taken in by Satan. Larry Bean, I truly pray for your soul. That concludes today's video. Please like, subscribe, share, leave a comment down below, and I will see you in the next one. Thank you. P.S. If you want to know how to spell Liturgicus interruptus and Bubulum stercus, Liturgicus is spelled Liturgicus. Interruptus is spelled Interruptus. Bubulum is spelled Bubulum, and stercus is spelled Stercus. Thanks for listening.
He gave to Simon Peter and to all of the 12 the keys of the kingdom, so darkness would never prevail. But some of the shepherds have pastured themselves on their sheep, so he has come out against them and scattered his people of faith.